Well, good evening to you all. It's nice to be back, to see you all, although I can't see you, but you can see me. But I know you're there and waiting to enter into the next session of our Holocaust course. And I hope that you've found some information that has been helpful to you to try and broaden your understanding of Holocaust. It is a subject which is really difficult, and I don't think any of us can understand it. I certainly can't understand it, and I can't come to terms with what happened during the Second World War with the persecution of the Jewish people, who were people who were actually blessing the cities and the countries in Europe rather than being opposed to them. And this terrible tragedy that happened to them was something which is beyond our understanding, I think. And what I'm trying to do with these sessions is trying to bring a chronological, principled understanding to how Holocaust developed from the time of Hitler's early life and what envisioned him to hate Jews so much, what caused him to hate the Jewish people so much that he could order the killing of 6 million Jews with an intention of killing 11 million Jews. So we've gone through the stages that has brought us to this week, which is looking at the extermination centers and looking at how they developed and looking at how some of the ways of killing really was a process that took place over a period of time, culminating in the gas chambers themselves. And we've looked at the killing fields, we've looked at the transports and all these other aspects of the process of killing and murdering Jews. And we are now at this place where we're looking at the extermination centers. And like always, I have books that I want to recommend. And I know I've recommended this book here. It's the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, produced by the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. And this is a great book. And I think I told you, didn't I, how to get the first 2 volumes of this book online. If you didn't catch that, all you need to do is to get onto the Holocaust Memorial Washington site and look at encyclopedias of camps and ghettos, and they will direct you to the page which you can download the first 2 volumes, which are actually 4 books altogether. This is just part B of volume 1. And there are 7 altogether, but you'll get the first 4 books free online, and you can download them onto your computer. So that's the first book I'm going to recommend. I'm going to recommend other books as we go through, but I'm going to go to my notes now, and then we'll start to look at this whole question of the extermination centers and how they developed, and I'm going to go through some of the centers themselves. So the first thing I want to do is to mention Bergen Belsen. Bergen Belsen was not created as a killing center or an extermination center, or whatever term you want to use. It wasn't created for that purpose, but by starvation, it did actually caused the deaths of so many Jews, and from 1940 onwards until its liberation in 1945, Bergen Belsen operated solely as a concentration camp, detaining prisoners of war, Jewish people, political prisoners, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, criminals, homosexuals, and others considered by the Nazi regime to be undesirables and not worthy of life. Conditions were absolutely horrific. Around 52,000 people were murdered, and I'm saying murdered, at Bergen Belsen through starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. None of the camps, whether they were ghettos or whether they were concentration camps or killing centers, none of them were there to allow Jews to live. The whole concept of the final solution was to murder every Jew throughout Europe, and that's including the 330,000 Jews in the British Isles at that time as well. So Bergen Belsen, although it was a concentration camp for all these prisoners, the Germans never intended that anybody would come out alive, and starvation and disease and brutal treatment caused the death of those 52,000 people in Bergen Belsen. So it was, in a sense, a killing center, as were many others. Although we're going to look at the main killing centers that were created as murder sites, killing centers, or killing or extermination facilities. I don't know what you can call them. It's just too horrific, really, to put a name to them, but we have to do that. Now, soldiers from the British 11th Armoured Division entered and liberated Bergen Belsen concentration camp complex without a fight on the 15th of April 1945. And Bergen Belsen was the first camp liberated by the British forces. And in fact, it was a Welsh battalion who went in there as well. And I've met some of those soldiers who went into Bergen Belsen, but none of them really wanted to talk about it. And some live quite locally to me here in North Wales. But one, a man called Sid Robinson, who was a lovely man, but he didn't want to talk about his experiences there. Such was the horror that they found when they entered Bergen Belsen. So Bergen Belsen, as I say, wasn't created as a murder camp or a killing center, but that's what it became through starvation and brutality. But I wanted to mention Bergen Belsen because it was so horrific, and something that we mustn't forget, a center we mustn't forget when we move into this area of the killing centers or the extermination camps such as Auschwitz and others. And that's where I'm going to start now, actually is with Auschwitz very shortly. But I want to say and give you some facts first of all. 90% of all those murdered in the death camps were Jews. The death camps were created for the annihilation or the genocide of the Jewish people. Almost everyone was killed immediately they arrived at the extermination centers. That's what their purpose was. The Nazis killed between 3 million and 3.5 million people in these centers throughout that short period of the war. There were also camps which were transit or concentration camps in which many died as well. We mustn't forget that. And they died, like, as I've said, in Bergen Belsen, of starvation, disease, and brutal murders. The minimum number of victims at the Auschwitz camp, which is the first camp we're going to look at, including the killing center at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is Auschwitz II, and we'll look and I'll talk a little bit about that, those numbers a bit later on. Between 1940 and 1945 are estimated at these figures. So the number of Jews deported to Auschwitz was 1,095,000, and 960,000 died, or actually were murdered. Non-Jewish Poles, there were 150,000 deported to Auschwitz, and 74,000 Poles died. Roma, 23,000 were deported to Auschwitz, and 21,000 died. Soviet prisoners of war, there were 15,000 deported, and 15,000 died. Nobody lived from the Soviet prisoners of war. And then from other nationalities, there were 25,000 deported to Auschwitz, and 15,000 died. Those numbers are absolutely huge. I shouldn't really use the term died, really. I should use the term were murdered at the hands of mankind. Now, there are a number of camps, and we'll go through quite a number of them, camps that were created specifically for killing. But the first one I think we need to address is Auschwitz, Auschwitz I. Now, the Nazis accepted prisoners at Auschwitz I from the 14th of June until the 27th of January 1945. And Auschwitz I was the headquarters for all the camps of the Auschwitz complex. And we're going to discuss the Auschwitz complex because most of us who have been to the camps will have been to Auschwitz I and to Auschwitz II. And we will maybe have had the idea that they were just the two camps that were involved, but there were others. There was Auschwitz III, which we'll come to shortly. Now, I've been to a number of camps, and I've been to Belsen and Neuengamme and others. But last year, Jill and Ed Walker took us to arranged a tour themselves and took us to Auschwitz, and it was a wonderful tour. So thank you, Jill and Ed, for taking us on that tour. I know you've been a number of times, and it impacted us all because it gave us an idea of the scale of the camps, and that's what I can't do by showing you pictures or even explaining to you, is the scale of these murder camps and how they worked. And what Jill and Ed did was facilitators to see inside the gas chambers, which was really difficult for us as tourists, if you like, to imagine what it was like. But it was really crucial that we did that because it gives us an understanding of how cruel and awful this was. And Auschwitz I was the first camp we went to, and as I say, that it was the headquarters of the whole of the complex. So the SS Administration Center was in Auschwitz I. And then we have Auschwitz II, or it's well known as Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is the place where this second Auschwitz was built. And Auschwitz II, Auschwitz-Birkenau, was the largest death camp run by the Germans during the Holocaust. And I think that's what I benefit from Jill and Ed Walker's tour, is that it gave us an idea of the scale. Auschwitz II was absolutely huge. And what impacted me, I think, most of all, is the latrines that are still there, and you can see how hundreds of people had to go to the latrines together in something which wouldn't be acceptable for animals today. So really impacted me. And if you get a chance after the lockdown, please go to the camps. I would love to take the young people from our congregation there and give them experience. I know my son and daughter would like to go, and others, Becky and Helen and Sarah Darnell, who would also like to go there, and Dave Rutter and others. So it's important that we all go there and see, because it gives you an idea of the scale. Now, the SS killed more people in Auschwitz than any other of the Nazi death camps. The SS actually built Auschwitz's gas chambers. Well, it was a private company, as we're going to come to learn, so that 2,000 people could fit inside each chamber at the same time. They were huge. And this meant that they were able to kill about 2,000 people every 30 minutes in these gas chambers. That is an unbelievable figure. I don't know how you could imagine that without actually going. But I'll just read those figures again, that the chambers were built to kill 2,000 people at a time every 30 minutes. Now, Auschwitz, that was Auschwitz II. Auschwitz III, considered to be a subcamp, was called Monowitz. And in Monowitz, there was also attached to Monowitz 48 subcamps around it, in which prisoners were forced to work making weapons for the German army. Monowitz opened in 1941. By October 1942, prisoners had completed the building of Monowitz. The camp was privately owned by IG Farben. So it's a private camp, and IG Farben actually built Auschwitz. The camp was created by this company, and this was the first camp to be paid for and built by a private company. At the end of between 1941 and 1945, about 35 prisoners worked at the IG Farben factory, which was connected to Monowitz III. 7 out of every 10 of these prisoners, about 25,000, died from starvation, disease, and being forced to work under deplorable conditions. The average prisoners lived for only 3 months after being sent to Monowitz. So Monowitz is Auschwitz III, if you like, in this complex of camps, these murder camps. So we have Auschwitz I, which was the first one, and then we have Auschwitz II, which is Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is the biggest one of all. And then this third one, which was Auschwitz III, known as Monowitz, not so well known, built by a private company, and the labor at that camp was used for IG Farben's purposes. Now, at the end of World War II, the German chemical manufacturer IG Farben was identified as the company that not only built the camps and helped to build them, but also used Zyklon B gas in the gas chambers themselves. Farben's executives knew what the gas was being used for, and their engineers designed the gas chambers. So it was IG Farben was really involved in the creation of the gas chambers, the camps themselves, and the gas that was involved. Now, I went to IG Farben's headquarters in Hamburg 3 years ago, and that was a beautiful set of offices. And I applaud the German government, because what they did was they gave the offices of IG Farben to Ebenezer, the charity that works with the Aliyah community of Jews going back to live in Israel. So they have this complex now, which is a beautiful office floor with beautiful furniture, beautiful place in the center of Hamburg, and they have it now. So IG Farben had lost everything, but and quite rightly, because they were heavily involved in the creation of the gas and the killing centers. Jews from all over Europe began arriving in Auschwitz on deportation trains, and we looked at the transports last week, and they started in the spring of 1942. Now, what I want to do is to recommend a book to you regarding the first people who went into Auschwitz, and you might be surprised to know that the first 900 people who went into Auschwitz were women. And you can read about this book, you can read about this in a book called The 900, written by Heather Doone McAdam. And that's the book. And it's about the 900 girls from Slovakia who were taken into Auschwitz by train and murdered in Auschwitz. And I'll just read part of this, the forward to you. It says, on March the 25th, 1942, nearly 1,000 young, unmarried Jewish women boarded a train in Poprad, Slovakia. Filled with a sense of adventure and national pride, they left their parents' homes wearing their best clothes and confidently waving goodbye, believing they were going to work in a factory for a few months. They were eager to report for government service. Instead, the young women, many of them teenagers, were sent to Auschwitz. Their government paid 500 Reichsmarks, which is about £160 today, for the Nazis to take them as slave labor. Of those 999, the book says, innocent deportees, only a few survived. So that is the book called The 900, and these are women from Slovakia. We look at other countries, don't we? Hungary, Poland, Belarus, and Latvia and Lithuania, but not many people actually study the Slovakian situation, and this book is well worth looking at if you want to look at Auschwitz and Slovakia. So I recommend that to you. Now that was in the spring 1942. Now only a fraction of those people who survived the on arrival selections went to work. by mid-1943, all registered Jewish inmates had been moved from Auschwitz main camp to the Birkenau main camp, which had been built by then. On arrival, prisoners were divided into those who would be used for labor and those to be gassed immediately. Those who were chosen for labor were separated, men from women. As we discussed in the ghettos session, when we looked at that, families kept together, but in the murder camps, men and women were separated. Also, twins were separated and kept separately for medical experiments. And we're going to look at the subject in a future session on eugenics, and we're going to look at Mengele and why he chose twins for experiments. And they were put into a separate area in the camp called the twins section. And the twins were used for experimental purposes. And I met one of Mengele's twins. And he and his brother were treated by Mengele injecting cancer cells into their throats to see how they would react. And Ephraim, the man that I met, he lost his brother at 9 years of age to this treatment, but he managed to survive. And Ephraim now speaks with a machine on his neck. So because after the war, he was operated to take out the cancer cells from his throat. So the twins were in a separate area. Pregnant women were always gassed on arrival. And actually, that's what I want to say to you tonight, is that there was a subject of abortion in Holocaust, and that is something that has been quite well studied now, because a doctor by the name of Priscilla Pearl was a gynecologist. She performed over 1,000 abortions in Auschwitz to save the lives of the mothers. And she did that purely for that reason. And abortion in Holocaust is quite a frightening subject to approach, but you'll see the story of Priscilla Pearl in a film called Out of the Ashes. And I'd like to go through that film with you. And I'll give you a couple of weeks to try and find you will source the film online, but it's well worth watching. Now, before we go through the film, I'd like you also to look at a survivor testimony from Auschwitz by a lady called Ruth Brand. Now, I can send you that survivor testimony or send you a link if you email me or email Rebecca, and you can listen to that testimony, because Ruth speaks about Priscilla Pearl and how Priscilla Pearl saved the lives of 1,000 mothers. Because as I've stated, in Holocaust, if you were seen to be pregnant, you were gassed immediately, because the Nazis didn't want Jewish babies being born, and they wanted to actually exterminate the whole Jewish race. So this is something that we'll look at in the next couple of weeks. Now, those chosen for labor were ultimately only there for the purposes of doing the jobs that needed to be done, the hard labor, some of the awful things that needed to be carried out in Nazi Germany during this period. And some of this labor would be used actually in the gas chambers themselves. And the Jews who were chosen to do that were called a Sonderkommando. And they were there to deal with the bodies of people who were gassed and the cremation of them. And that was just one of the jobs. But if you were chosen for labor, it wasn't a good thing. You just managed to survive. So that's what happened in Auschwitz, like every other camp. Some were chosen to be gassed immediately, some for experiments, and some just for the jobs that needed to be done before they were ultimately gassed, because some Sonderkommando were murdered after about 3 months anyway. But I'm just reading a book now by by a survivor of the Sonderkommando. And that book's really interesting, and I'll bring that to you next time. Sorry. Now, the task of guarding Auschwitz main camp, as well as Auschwitz II and Auschwitz III Monowitz and all the sub-camps, was the responsibility of the SS Death's Head Guard battalions. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the things that maybe you would not normally research. So I'm going to talk about some of the guards and how they worked. Now, this unit, the SS Death's Head Guard Battalion, grew along with the camp. So beginning with 500 guards in the late 1940s to 2,000 in July 1942 and over 4,500 in July 1945. That was the numbers of guards used to guard those camps. Now it started, the battalion started with a mixture of older men from the police, SS reservists, and transfers from the SS Guard units in other concentration camps, from the Allgemeine General SS and from the Waffen-SS Reserve and replacement formations of units that were either of people who were too old to serve in those units and be effective, and they were drafted into the Auschwitz complex to guard. Now that's a lot of people. The total number of guards actually within the Auschwitz complex came to over 7,000. Now they were 7,000 men and women who guarded the camps themselves, but also knew exactly what was going on. They couldn't have worked there and not known, because they saw the crematorium. So the idea that people didn't know is just impossible to accept. Because these 7,000 men and women would have had spouses and families. They would have talked and discussed what was happening there. And in fact, everybody knew what was happening at Auschwitz death camp in the later part of the war, because people did escape, and I'm going to look at those, and report to churches and to governments about what was happening there. Now, in March 1942, the first SS Women Guards auxiliaries arrived to guard the women's compound that had opened in Auschwitz main camp. And in June 1944, Hoss, who was the head of the guards, brought in 500 Wehrmacht veterans and gave them SS uniforms and used them as additional manpower during the extermination of Hungarian Jews. Now, I want to explain that a bit more. When Germany took over Hungary in 1944, the Hungarian government assisted Nazi Germany in deporting the Jews of Hungary. And there were mass transports coming into Auschwitz, arriving there with Hungarian Jews, and the complex, although it could take 2,000 people in each gas chamber, was becoming overwhelmed. And Hoss, the leader, brought in 500 extra men who were older men who to help with the transports, the arrival of the transports. So if you keep those figures in your head, I want to talk a bit about what happened at the end of the war with regard to the guards. So you can get a picture now of the numbers involved in just guarding the camps. Now, the prisoners were put to work from these camps with outside companies, those that weren't chosen to be gassed, of course. And those companies made requests to the SS Business Administration main office in Auschwitz I. So if you were a company near Auschwitz in the area, then you could ask for labor, and you would apply to Auschwitz I, the main administration point for the SS, for labor. And contracts with companies hiring prisoners had to state the labor they wanted. What type of labor? Was it something that women could do or something that men could do? And they agreed to pay fees for the accommodation of the guards, the food for the guards, and the clothing for the guards. So the private companies paid for those things. Besides, and they also paid for prisoner labor fees as well. And besides the prisoner labor fees, the company hiring was responsible for the costs of accommodation for the prisoners who were involved in the labor. The companies were required to erect a proper camp near to their workplace as well. And they had to pay for that, including a barracks for the prisoners and for the SS men who were guarding. They had to build warehouses and kitchens to outfit those premises with proper equipment, furnishings, sanitary facilities, latrines, as well as a security fence and watchtowers. So if you were a large company, like IG Farben would be one, but I'm going to name some other companies later, then you would have to pay for those things. You didn't get the labor free, but you paid the SS, which was a business ultimately, for all those things. Now, the SS administration covered the cost for feeding and clothing of the prisoners. So they covered those costs. Now, these workplaces, these labor camps, became sub-camps to Auschwitz, and to Monowitz in particular. So they were smaller camps where the labor was used in the businesses within the area. Now, the prisoners in the sub-camps were used for various industrial, agricultural, and construction and demolition work. They also carried out the most dangerous tasks, such as working with chemicals, as in the case of one of the sub-camps called, and I think I pronounced it right, Chesowitz sub-camp. And the job there was the removal of unexploded bombs from a local oil refinery and other industrial plants nearby, which were being bombed at regular intervals by the Allies. So this camp was created to house labor from the main camp so that they could dismantle bombs, unexploded bombs, and actually reconstruct some of the buildings in the industrial plants nearby. So it was quite a complex of labor force which was used to do the jobs that were most dangerous and which ordinary civilians wouldn't want to do, or even the army wouldn't want to do. Now, I mentioned agriculture because Auschwitz 1, 2, and 3 needed to source food supplies, and they created sub-camps outside which would produce food. So the SS created sub-camps, and one, I'm going to give you an example, one at Babitz, which was created by the SS on the site of the village of Babitz, which had been evacuated in April 1941 because of what was happening in the area, although there were still villagers staying there. Now, prisoners coming from the Auschwitz murder camp in the labor detachments, first of all, demolished some of the village buildings, and the material was used to build the buildings, to build farm buildings. Now, the farm was used to cultivate the ground and the surrounding area, so that they also built shippons for milking cows and built buildings for cattle, because they started to create a complete farm which was both horticultural and meat production. And it was under the charge of Joachim Caesar, the director of all the sub-camp farms. I hope I'm explaining this okay to you. So you've got this farm that's been built by laborers from Auschwitz, producing agricultural products for the camps. And in charge of that was this guy, Caesar, who was the director of a number of other sub-camps, which were also farms. Initially, numerous male and female prisoner detachments from Auschwitz camp, as well as Auschwitz-Birkenau, bred the animals and did the farming. So that's what they did. That's what these laborers were there for. The SS established this particular subcamp in March 1943 with approximately 60 male and 50 female prisoners. And they were housed in pre-war school buildings that were still left standing and neighboring wooden barracks. Now, the female prisoners lived in the school building and the male prisoners in the barracks, so they were still separated. Now, the building and barracks were surrounded by barbed wire. You can imagine this in a village situation. At the corners of the fence, there were elevated watch platforms where SS men stood guard. The first group of prisoners consisted of mostly of Jews aged between 20 years and 30 years old, so they were younger people who could work. However, they were killed a short time later, in fact, within 6 weeks of completing the building. And about 200 Poles and Greek Jews and Russian Jews were brought in to replace them. So you can imagine this camp is set up, this farm, if you like, is set up surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, and anybody in the area would know what it was about. The food for the prisoners was brought in from the Birkenau camp. The prisoners got a meal 3 times a day. Only, though, a bitter coffee in the morning. For lunch, they had soup, which was made from rotten cabbage or potatoes with their skins on. In the evening, there was a piece of bread, which was 250 grams, that's about 8 ounces, with some margarine, and sometimes they were given sausage and jam and coffee. Now, the clothing for the prisoners was also brought in from Birkenau, from the discarded clothing from those who were murdered. The location of the Babich camp also meant that there was some contact between the civilian population in the area, although most had been evacuated, and the camp itself. There's evidence of some medical aid coming in from local villages for the prisoners, but also for the guards. So we know that people in the area were well aware of the situation of this camp and where the produce was going to, which was to the main 3 camps. Now, when I was in Yad Vashem, I was taken to Hadassah Hospital, where I visited the psychology department there, and I was shown by a doctor there a film of Dr. Munch, who was second in command at Auschwitz, and this film was an interview of Munch himself, and being asked the question, what was it like at the end of the war with regard to the food supplies going into Auschwitz? Because as these camps, these smaller sub-camps were being liberated, the food rations were going down, and the guards were not able to get proper food. And Munch says in this interview that he ordered the chefs to go to the crematorium for meat. I was absolutely horrified to hear this, but we forget sometimes that Auschwitz needed food from places like these sub-camp farms to continue. But at the end of the war, it just went horribly into a place where Munch should even given permission for that to happen. Can you imagine that deplorable situation? And how someone could actually order that is beyond me, but Munch didn't appear to think that was terrible. Now, there was such a thing as resistance at Auschwitz. And I mentioned the Sonderkommando, didn't I? And they used dynamite in early October 1944 to try and blow up the crematoria and halt the gassings. They did everything they could. I mean, Jews were crying out to God for the British and the Americans to bomb Auschwitz, even if they would be killed. Such was the horror there. And as I say, the Sonderkommando tried to blow up the crematorium. The attempt, however, failed, and the SS killed all the Sonderkommando involved. There were several other successful escapes from Auschwitz, dozens in fact. beginning in June 1940 and continuing to December 1944. The most famous escape was on the 7th of April 1944, when two Slovak Jews, Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wetzler, fled successfully, and they traveled to Slovakia to inform the Allies about Auschwitz and warn the Hungarian Jews of the SS plans for their extermination. Their report eventually reached President Roosevelt via the Slovakian underground through Swiss intelligence services. So Roosevelt knew, but actually we have evidence that the churches knew about these things, because the records of churches being told what was going on there are available. But there was this resistance in Auschwitz. People just didn't go like lambs to the slaughter in the way that we're taught. There were people, like in the ghettos, trying to oppose what was happening, Jews who fought against what the Nazis were doing, and we mustn't forget those stories. Now, of the approximately 7,000 SS personnel who served at Auschwitz between June the 14th, 1940 and January the 18th, 1945, survived the war, less than 10% of those, only about 630, were apprehended and tried after 1945 for their participation in the persecution and mass murder of 6 million Jews. Most of the trials of the Auschwitz SS personnel took place in Poland immediately after the war, and in West Germany between 1963 and 1976. There were no Auschwitz defendants at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. So let me just pull that apart a little bit for you. Of the approximately 7,000 SS personnel who served at Auschwitz between those years, in those 1940 to 1945, from Auschwitz I to Auschwitz and Monowitz, of those who survived the war, less than 10%, which is, as I say, 630, were tried after 1945, but none of them were tried in the Nuremberg war crime trials. And now, there were other trials called the International Military Tribunals, which followed the Nuremberg trials, and people like Hess, who was tried in Warsaw, actually stood in the Supreme National Tribunal, which came into being in 1946 in January, to try, like Rudolf Hess and the Nazis and other SS war criminals, leaders in the main, who committed the crimes at Auschwitz. The tribunal tried Hess between March the 11th and March the 29th, 1947, and they sentenced him to death and had him hanged in Auschwitz main camp on the 16th of April 1947. And if you go to the main camp Auschwitz I, you can see where he was hung. Now, sitting in Krakow from November the 26th to December the 16th, 1947, the Supreme National Tribunal then went on to try 40 members of the Auschwitz SS, including Hess's successors as Auschwitz commander Leibenschnell. Now, Leibenschnell and 6 other officers were sentenced to death and hanged. 6 others received life sentences, and another 7 drew 15-year sentences. So out of the 40, there was just a few that were hanged, and others received life sentences or 15-year sentences. And these were the leaders in Auschwitz. And we're talking just a few out of the 7,000. In all the post-war Auschwitz trials, the Poles indicted 602 SS men and women from Auschwitz. They tried 590 and convicted 584 and sentenced 97% of those to prison terms, ranging from 6 months to 15 years. So the sentences were very, very mediocre, really. The West German courts began investigating war crimes which were committed at Auschwitz SS by the personnel there in 1950. Over the next 30 years, they convened 4 separate legal proceedings in Frankfurt, Maine, and against a score, that's all, 20 Auschwitz SS defendants. The most notable Frankfurt trial took place between 1963 and August 1965, when just 22 former SS defendants were tried, with 17 of them convicted and sentenced to prison, 6 to life, and 11 to terms ranging from 3 to 20 years. These men knew what was happening at Auschwitz, but the sentences were really poor. The Auschwitz trials, lasting from 1966 to 1968, brought charges against 5 defendants, and they resulted in 4 convictions. The last Frankfurt trial of Auschwitz SS officers lasted from December 1973 to February 1976 and involved just 2 defendants. German prosecutors ultimately dropped both cases because of the health and age problems affecting both the defendants and the witnesses. Richard Bayer, the last commandant of Auschwitz, between May 1944 and January 1945, was arrested in 1960 and died in detention in 1963. The East Germans tried only 1 senior officer from Auschwitz. In 1966, the former SS camp doctor Horst Fischer was tried. He was convicted and executed for the selection and gassing of inmates at Auschwitz. In post-war Austria, there were only 2 trials of Auschwitz SS, both of which ended in acquittals. And most of these prisoners, or these defendants in the trials, were brought to the notice of the authorities by Simon Wiesenthal, who fought valiantly to make sure that every SS officer was tried. But these are just a few people out of the 7,000. He couldn't take on the whole task himself, obviously, but he did his best, and he was really important in that. Simon, if you get onto Google with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, you can hear his story, and he an amazing man. Now, the Czechs brought 3 cases against former SS personnel, all of whom they convicted. They sentenced to death and hanged them. There was also a British military tribunal proceeding in 1945 against the SS administration at the Bergen Belsen concentration camp, at which the main SS defendant was Joseph Kramer. Kramer had served at Auschwitz in 1940 as an adjutant and deputy commandant, and then again in 1944 as the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The British tried, convicted, and executed him, but he was the only one, because the British were lenient with the SS. Now, I'm going to show you another book here now, which is a book written by David Cesarani, who sadly died 2 years ago. He was a historian who wrote a lot about Holocaust, and in his book, Justice Delayed, he writes about the issues of the lack of will to try some of the Auschwitz guards. And he looks at all sorts of scenarios where people should have been tried for the murders, or the involvement in the murders of the over 1 million Jews who were murdered at Auschwitz. Now, as far as Britain is concerned, we received 10,000 SS officers into the UK after the war, who worked in the steel mining and other manufacturing industries in the UK, including textiles. An example of one of them is Alphonse Rebane, who was a commander in the 20th Waffen SS in the Estonian division, who had been awarded by the Nazis the highly prized Knight's Cross. And he was given work in the textile mills of West Yorkshire under a program called the European Voluntary Workers Program. Now that program was brought into law after the war so that we could bring in people from Europe, displaced persons, to work in our industries, because we were short of manpower. We'd lost an awful lot of manpower in the war, men, soldiers, young men particularly, who had died in the war. And we wanted men to come in to work in the industries. But we allowed 10,000 SS officers in. And we knew they were SS officers because they had the tattoo with their blood group tattooed on them. And actually, years after the war, people like Lord Alex Carlisle, whose mother was a survivor from Holocaust, brought about the War Crimes Act 1994 in the British government, but there was no will to prosecute these men for what they had done. So issues regarding the punishment for the murderers in the death camps still resound throughout the corridors of governments, because they never actually dealt with them. Now it's 10 to 8 now. I'll start to go through some of the other death camps, the extermination camps that were built specifically as murder camps, as extermination camps in Europe for the purposes of murdering Jews and for nothing else. Now, Belzec in Poland was an extermination camp which was built in 1941 and stayed open as a murder camp until June 1943. And when I talk about these numbers, they are huge numbers that we are looking at, because in Belzec, which some of you may not have even heard of, there were 434,508 people murdered at this one concentration camp. Another camp, which was built specifically for the murder of Jews, was Chelmo at Poland. And this camp was open from December 1941 to April 1943. And it actually reopened in 1944 in April and closed again in January 1945. And when I say closed, actually it was liberated in 1945 by the Russians. And there were 152,000 Jews murdered at Chelmo in Poland. Horrific situation. The gas chambers were built there, crematoria were built there specifically for the murder of Jews, and they were Jews from the ghettos in Poland, like Lodz and Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis needed to find a way of murdering the Jews when they liquidated the ghettos, because the ghettos, as I've said, were only specifically for as holding pens for Jews before there was facilities to murder them. Jews were not ever going to leave ghettos to freedom. They were only ever going to leave the ghettos to be murdered. And Chelmo was built to facilitate that. And 152 deaths in that one facility. Now in Ionesco in the Ukraine, that was a transit labor camp and an extermination camp, actually in the Ukraine itself. It was built in September 1941 and closed in November 1943. There was 35,000 people murdered at Ionesco. A horrible place again. We forget that these places existed in other parts of Eastern Europe. We just think that they were there in Poland, but actually they were spread across all German occupied territory. Now, Majdanek is another extermination camp built in Poland specifically for the murder of Jews. And that was opened between October 1941 and July 1944. And there were 78,000 deaths at Majdanek. Now, Mali Trostinets in Belarus, I've been there with Keith Darnell, who's a pastor at our church. We both went there when we went to teach in Belarus, and we went to this camp, and that was quite horrific to see how Russian and Hamburg Jews were killed, Belarusian Jews. And this was open between July 1941 and forced to close when Russia took over in June 1944. There were 65,000 deaths at Trostinets, Mali Trostinets. Now, Shamista in Serbia, I want you to broaden your outlook if you thought there was just 6 murder camps, because this was another one, but in Serbia, not in Poland. And this was open between October 1941 and July 1944. There were 23,000 deaths in this one camp. And then another specially built camp at Sobibor in Poland. This was a camp open between 1942 and October 1943. There were 250,000 deaths there. 250,000 Jews murdered at Sobibor. I have a friend who's on the board of trustees at Sobibor, and he told me quite a bit about what went on there, and it was absolutely horrific. And Sobibor actually was one of those camps where the Germans tried to dismantle it completely and hide it and grow trees before the end of the war to disguise the despicable acts that they'd committed at Sobibor. So there's excavations taking place at Sobibor today to try and just show what had happened there. At Syrets in the Ukraine, which was a labor and extermination camp, which was open between July 1942 and July 1943, there were 25,000 deaths, 25,000 Jews murdered. At Treblinka extermination camp, between July 1942 and July 1943, this is in one death camp, 900,000 Jews were murdered. That's nearly 1 million. At Mauthausen camp, the Mauthausen camp in Austria was opened in May 1938 to mine granite, first of all, from a nearby quarry owned by the city of Vienna. So the city actually owned the granite quarry. The company who quarried the granite was Weiner Graben, whose owners were Theodor Eick and Oswald Poe. The initial workforce was made up of prisoners from Dachau, but after 1939, political, homosexual, Roma, and Jewish prisoners were forced to work at this camp in the most appalling conditions. During the war, Mauthausen had 5 subcamps. The camp itself was built by prisoners and was funded by loans from a number of sources, including commercial loans from the Dresdner Bank, the Commercial Bank, and the Reinhardt Fund, which was money stolen from the inmates of the concentration camps themselves, and from the German Red Cross. So this murder camp and labor camp was funded privately by the banks who had stolen money from the Jews. The camp was liberated in May 1945, and the exact number of deaths is not yet known, but it's said to be at least 100,000. And I say not yet known because people are still researching. Most of the deaths occurred as a result of forced labor and starvation and cruelty at Mauthausen. The next camp I come to is one that I studied when I was at Yad Vashem, and it absolutely appalled me. And this is Jasenovac in Croatia. And this was a murder camp specifically for murder. And it was it had 5 sub-camps. It was the only camp in the whole of the Holocaust. And I hate using the word camp. I should use the word center. It was the only one where children were separated from the adults and actually were in a separate camp and had to look after themselves, even babies and tiny ones. And it was the only murder camp where the murder took place by knives by the Croatian Ustaša. And they used to strap knives to their wrists and murder the prisoners by stabbing them. And they strapped the knives there because it was so painful to hold the knives. Such was the numbers that they were murdering. So Jasenovac in Croatia was a camp, and there's an argument about how many people were murdered at Jasenovac, and I've heard figures up to 700,000 Serbs, homosexuals, Freemasons, and also the majority Jews. And there is still a museum at this camp, but I question actually what the true figures are regarding the deaths at the camp. But some give up to 700,000. That was an awful lot. And the camp was run by a Catholic friar called Miloslav. He was a priest, and he ran the camp. He was also a nationalist, a Croatian nationalist. Milipovac, his name was, and he was a really cruel man. And I speak about him on our Hidden Treasures course as well, when we look at Holocaust information there. Now, it's 8 o'clock, but if I can, I want to just finish off with the camps so that we can move on next week to another subject. And I want to, if I can, just for the next 5 minutes, if you'll stay with me for this long, just speak about Neuengamme in Germany. I visited Neuengamme about 5 years ago, and it was a labor camp and extermination camp, both together. Now, it opened in December 1938 and closed in May 1945, when it was liberated by the Allies, the British and the Americans. There were 42,900 deaths at Neuengamme, and the camp was centered around the production of bricks. It was a labor camp initially, and this camp amazingly had 75 sub-camps. And this is why it's important for us to know about this camp. And the prisoners in these sub-camps were used in the shipping industry, which was owned by the Krupp company, a private company. And prisoners were also used to build U-boats, and one U-boat in particular in secret bunkers around the Bremen area. Now, the labor from Neuengamme, main camp, was used in the town, in the bakery, in Glunst ironmongers, and in the timber merchants. So people knew in the area. The local Lutheran church cooperated with the SS administration in the camp over the sale of such property to be used for the railway to make transportations to the camp more efficient. Now, how I know that is because when I went to the archives in Neuengamme, I was able to source, and I don't think anybody had sourced this document before, a contract between the local church and the SS administration of the camp for the sale of church property, land situated at the back of the church, so the train could go more directly into Neuengamme. So people in the area really knew what was going on at Neuengamme. When I went there, I was struck by the wire fence and the watchtowers and the crematorium, which is only 3 kilometers away from the town. So everybody knew what was going on there at the camp. Neuengamme was also used for medical experiments. Now, I'm going to read something, and you might find it a bit uncomfortable, so you might want to turn off now, or if you don't want to listen to it. But I think when we look at medical experiments, we usually look at Auschwitz and Mengele and what he was doing there. But other camps had used medical experiments for a eugenics program that the Germans were running in collaboration with the Americans. So because the Americans knew the American eugenicists knew what was going on with regard to experiments. So I'm going to read you an example of a medical experiment that took place in Neuengamme. So in November 1944, 20 Jewish children, 10 boys and 10 girls, had been brought from Auschwitz to Neuengamme. The youngsters aged between 5 and 12 years of age came from all over Europe. The children had witnessed the murder of parents and siblings and other relatives. They had no relatives left alive. And they were brought to Neuengamme specifically as human guinea pigs in a series of medical experiments conducted by SS doctor Kurt Heischmeier. Heischmeier removed the children's lymph glands for analysis, and he injected living tuberculosis bacteria in their veins and directly into the lungs to determine if they had natural immunities to tuberculosis. They were carefully observed, examined, and photographed as the disease progressed. The condition of all the children obviously deteriorated very rapidly, and they became extremely ill. Now, this was in November 1944. In April 1945, just a few days before the war ended, Heischmeier and SS officer Arnold Strippel decided to kill the children in an effort to hide the evidence of the experiments from the approaching Allied forces, because it was clear that the British and the Americans were going to take control of Neuengamme. And they wanted to conceal all the traces, so the SS transported the children to a former Bullhosen Dam School. That was the name of the school. I'm sorry about my pronunciations. I'm not good at pronouncing words very well. And this had been used as a satellite camp since October 1944. And these children were immediately taken to the school. They were taken to the basement, and they were ordered to undress. And an SS officer later reported in a written report, he said this: they sat down on the benches all around and were cheerful and happy that they'd been once allowed outside of Camp Neuengamme. The children were completely unsuspecting. The children were told that they had to be vaccinated against typhoid fever before their return journey, when in actual fact they were injected with morphine. They were then hanged from hooks on the wall, but the SS men found it difficult to kill the mutilated children. The first child was so light that he couldn't hang. He was diseased and suffering from malnutrition, and he couldn't. His weight wouldn't allow him to be hung. So the SS officer, one of the SS officers, had to use his own weight to pull down on the child. Then the others, two at a time, were hanged from different hooks. Just in a terrible situation for these poor young children. And the report said and reported that none of the children actually died. Now, I'll just finish with Neuengamme now. I hope that hasn't upset you, but there's some of the reports that are available for us to read and to see the inhumanity of what was taking place. Now, as Allied forces approached Neuengamme, 7,000 prisoners were released and loaded into 3 ships in Lübeck Harbor. And I've been really interested in this subject for a number of years because of what happened next. They were loaded onto 3 ships. The first one was the Thielbeck, the second one was the Cap Arcona, and the third one was the Deutschland. And those ships were anchored in Lübeck Harbor. Now, on the 3rd of May 1945, these ships were bombed under orders from the British government by our own Air Force, Royal Air Force, Hawker Typhoons, and nearly all of the 700,000 prisoners perished. Now, I've got a book here, which is a really good book on this very subject, and it's called The Nazi Titanic by Robert P. Watson. And you can read about the bombing of these 3 ships and what happened at that time. And we really don't understand why the British Air Force would bomb 3 ships carrying prisoners. In fact, one of the pilots reported back to his senior officer when he flew over the ships for the first time that he could see that the people on board were wearing striped clothing as if they were prisoners. And he was told to keep to his mission and bomb the ships. So that was the end of the prisoner situation at Neuengamme, and a horrific situation there again. So I know this has been quite a hard subject for you tonight, and I finished now, and I hope that you can put aside some of the things that you've heard, but I hope also that you've learned something about the death camps and the terrible murder of Jewish people throughout Europe during the Holocaust. And next week we're going to touch on the subject of eugenics, and I don't know how, if any of you are aware of that and aware of the use of eugenics within Holocaust, but it is a subject that we do need to explore, and that's what we will do next week at 7 o'clock. So please have a good evening. Please put out of your mind anything that's upset you, but please hold on to the things that you can teach others about, because Holocaust denial is a problem and we need to tell the truth. So can I say good night to you, Lila Toff, and every blessing. So good night.